My pain flares up a lot, and it's hard to focus on my improvements because I'm anticipating what my pain will do next. So how can I keep flares in perspective? And this is a really common experience because the anticipation of pain getting worse is something that I think universally people who are, working with pain and are on pain journeys, it will always come up. One thing I want to bring up at the very beginning is the anticipation of pain is processed by the brain in the same way that actual pain is processed. So keep that in mind, and that the anticipation of pain, the expectation of pain is almost like rehearsal from your brain's perspective, rehearsal that pain will get worse. One thing that really comes up for me whenever I think about the importance of pain flares is a study that was done by our co-founder, Vanya Apkarian, a few years before we even started Aivo. And this is actually one of the pieces of research that it's one of the reasons why we're so intent on tracking daily fluctuations in pain. So I'm going to go over this study and then we can discuss what it means and how you can apply the findings. So the Apkarian group learned that many people actually didn't recall accurately the daily pain levels that they were reporting in the moment. So it was a study where people had smartphones and they were rating their pain twice a day, very similar to an Aivo. And whenever they looked over the data after it was collected, over a 3-month time period for the study, over 70% of people, whenever they were asked how much was your average pain in the prior month, for example, recalled that their pain was 20% more intense than their day-to-day ratings. And this is really interesting. It's a phenomenon called recall bias, and it's something the brain naturally does. This isn't malingering, this isn't lying. This is a natural protective mechanism where the brain interprets pain in a certain way, past pain in a certain way that amplifies its importance. So I want to make it very clear that just because this is something the brain naturally does doesn't mean it's wrong or that it's manipulative. It has a protective function. And one of the interesting things is this memory recall persisted many months. So even if they asked 6 months later, what was your average pain level during the study period, they would still remember the highest level of pain that they experienced. So they looked into this, like what was going on here? And what they found was that the memory of pain is influenced by 3 things. So another way of saying this is your memory of your pain flares in the past is influenced by 3 things. One is the peak pain intensity during the period of time. So if I ask you in the past month, what's your average pain level? Your average pain level will be really colored, really biased by the maximum pain intensity that you experienced during that period. It's also colored by the most recent pain intensity. So if we step back from that and look at it from the brain's perspective, your brain is paying attention to the worst pain can get, and also what pain has been like most recently. So there's something about that your brain finds much more interesting than the actual fluctuations of pain from day to day. It's paying attention to the worst that it can get and what recently has happened, which means it's like, okay, this is how bad it can get. And right now, based on the past few days, it's only been this level. Those are the 2 things that your brain pays a lot of attention to. And also, about half of the variability or half of the amount of this bias, this recall bias, was also explained by recent mood ratings, which means that your memory of past pain is impacted by your recent mood in the previous few days. So what this means is that the way that we remember pain is biased naturally based on what the brain thinks is most important. And the brain always cares about what just happened, what is happening, what's about to happen. So the brain is looking at the peak pain intensity during the previous weeks or months as an indicator of what to watch out for. So this is something that happens naturally in people with chronic pain. This isn't there isn't anything wrong with this because it's something the brain actually does. But as you can see, it becomes a little complicated whenever you then have to live with this biased expectation of how bad the pain can get. One of the other interesting things about this pattern follows the peak end rule. And this is a rule that was identified by Daniel Kahneman, who is a neuroscientist, cognitive neuroscientist. And this is actually a phenomena that has been described in other cognitive processes. So it's not just specific to pain, but it's the idea that the brain naturally pays attention whenever something is fluctuating. It pays attention to what just happened and the maximum of what happened. So in this case, the peak flare pain intensity levels.
Unknown caller.
And if everyone can just mute, that'd be super cool. Thank you. So let's look at what you can do with this information, because whenever I give this type of information, I like to be able to say, what can you do to act on this? So take this with a grain of salt. One of the first things you can do is try to reduce the magnitude of peak pain. And I do think that this is possible because, some of the work that we do through Aivo, but also whenever you work to identify a flare right whenever it's beginning and take actions, proactive actions to curb the onset of those pain flares, that gives you an opportunity to change how intense it can get. So the first step here is to look at, let's say, the previous week or month, and think to yourself, what was the magnitude, the peak magnitude of pain that you remember? How intense at the maximum has your pain had? And if you have, and in a sense, it doesn't matter what your actual pain was, it matters what you remember it was. So let's say that in the past month, the maximum pain, it got up to 7 out of 10, or maybe 3 out of 10, whatever you're working with. So you have that number in your mind. That is my maximum pain level. Then what you do is you start to study yourself and notice physical cues, both in your body and external cues in your life, that seem to precede these pain escalations. So before a flare happens, how do you feel it in your body? Are there specific cues? Do you start to feel a certain kind of pain? Do you start to notice that your heart rate is increasing, or you feel more overwhelmed in your body? Are there external cues, for instance, stress or visiting in-laws, or some typical social interaction that tends to trigger a stress or a pain flare? So if you look at these two things, then you have cues that are predicting when it could get worse at a higher level of resolution because you're sort of studying it in the moment. So what that means is that, first of all, you've determined your maximum pain level, let's say 7 out of 10 in this example. You know what types of things are most likely to lead to these pain flares. Then you create a coping plan. And this is something that it'll be multiple iterations of this, because coping plans can evolve. Sometimes you need a different plan for different situations. But whenever you start to notice these initial cues, for instance, the certain type of pain in your body that happens only whenever it's going to get that certain quality of intense, for example, you start coping at the early levels instead of waiting until the pain has really started to amp up strongly to, for instance, 6 or 7. So you start coping early. And by doing this, you can curb the maximum magnitude of these pain flares. And that's one of the reasons why in the Aivo app, we have reminders or notifications, you're in a pain flare period, to where whenever, if you get one of those notifications, you can think back to the previous day and think, okay, what were the signs that this was going to happen? Not just sort of in a curious way. Because whenever you identify the cues that often precede these pain escalations, that gives you the specific knowledge that you can use to cope really proactively. The other aspect of this is aiming to limit how variable pain becomes. And in that sense, the goal, instead of big wide fluctuations of high to low, high to low, high to low, indirectly, you'll be doing this by curbing the peak magnitude of some of the pain flares. But also what you can do in other areas of life is make steps to reduce the variability of your nervous system, meaning you pace activities more often rather than, for instance, pushing your body a little bit too much, which might increase the pain a bit more. Another thing that sort of falls into this same idea, and we're going to talk about this in a few other of the questions we covered today, is keeping a baseline parasympathetic tone to where, for instance, if emotions come up, if a stressor comes up, you're more able to cope with it in a way that it doesn't escalate. So in a sense, this is trying to maintain a really strong baseline. This also involves increasing your awareness of your flare thresholds. Is there a point of no return? Or is there a period where, like, you know that you can, for instance, influence whether you get a pain flare or not, and the coping techniques work? If there's a point of no return, which is just essentially like, okay, it's going to go full throttle, at that point, you shift into a self-soothing mindset, where right now, whatever you know works best for you, whatever you can do to calm your nervous system, that's what you do. And so essentially the limit of the variability of pain, you can do that just by monitoring your sympathetic nervous system, your fight flight response on a daily basis. And you can essentially try to prevent the magnitude of the flares increasing to the same level by keeping a strong parasympathetic tone. So these are the things that I suggest most whenever pain flares have a really dominant place in someone's personal pain experience.